Over 70 people from your lab became faculties. What are the earliest signs that they're becoming ready to compete for faculty?
We run a sort of internal simulated competing for faculty positions process.
There were more than 500 applicants.
It's challenging to really stick out at that level that you described.
You basically have to be in the top 1% just to be invited on campus.
A lot of people apply when it feels just a little early, and often they'll get the Zoom interview, or maybe they don't get the in-person interview, or if they get the Zoom and the in-person in, they don't get the job, and so they get to compete again next year.
What do you usually tell them? Just leave academia or do a second postdoc?
It's just incredible, the diversity of things that you can do with a PhD and postdoc.
What makes then a top 1 recommendation letter?
The most important thing is
over 70 people from your lab became faculties. So when you're mentoring students and postdocs, what are the earliest signs that they're becoming ready to compete for faculty applications?
Yeah, I think one sign is that somebody's starting to get close to being ready to compete is that they're starting to define the direction of their research project even more independently. I mean, that's a progression that occurs first over the course of the PhD. I typically expect a doctoral student in their first year or two to actually maybe work with a senior colleague to help define their first project. And then partway through the PhD, they'll define their own project, but maybe it's sort of following on a theme. And postdocs who to me are starting to look like they might be about at the stage of submitting their dossiers for faculty positions are also often really driving a research agenda initially within my group, but it's obviously an indicator that they're getting ready to drive their own independent research agenda when they're a PI.
When you say they're ready to drive the independent research agenda, what do you mean specifically? How do you notice it? Because there are many postdocs who claim, well, we're ready. We do our own project that we can take to a new position with us. But is it really what is expected when they have to compete for that top 1%?
Yeah, I think I'd say the early sign is maybe not that they've necessarily figured out how to define an entire research program. I mean, that's what they need to do when they're competing for the faculty positions. They need to go to the interview with their program of maybe 3 projects, which have some like different timescales associated with them. Maybe what will they do to really get ramped up in their faculty position in the first couple of years? What will be the rest of their pre-tenure plan, and what will be some really transformative and longer-term research agenda that will take them through tenure and into their mid-career. But when they're a postdoc and they're working in my group, it might be more that they would define a project rather than an entire program, and that this would be something that really had their fingerprints all over it. It was really their idea and their personality. But I'm talking about something on the scale of a nice, big, high-impact paper rather than an entire group-wide research agenda.
Would you say that that paper is crucial for landing a position or at least being invited to an interview at a decent university, like going through all this competition? Or would you advise people to start applying in the first year while they're still developing the project, but they have a momentum from the PhD time?
I think like when I look at now a CV that will get the attention of a committee, I look mainly for the set of first authored papers, and I would often look at whether 1 or 2 of those had, ended up in kind of a high impact interdisciplinary journal with the postdoc in question as the first author. And then I would look for kind of an accompanying set of papers in other excellent, but possibly sort of excellent discipline-specific journals, like kind of a collection of works in great places like JACS and Advanced Materials and Joule and places like that. So I would look at that. I feel like one can spot whether somebody's likely at least to get the Zoom interview for the first round of interviewing, really based on the published record. And I should add that if that happens to have all come from an incredibly productive and impactful PhD, I mean, that's totally fine. Like that doesn't have to have been acquired during the postdoc.
For many faculty positions, especially in the US, my experience was that there were more than 500 applicants. So when you have so many people applying for a faculty position, you basically have to be in the top 1% just to be invited on campus. And it's not really being about top 10% postdocs. It's about being top 1%. And that's a big difference. So how would you, as a faculty with so much experience, how would you define the difference between top 1 and top 10%? Because getting into the top 10 is something that we can understand how to get there, but being top 1, it's really hard to see what it means to be top 1.
I think it's a great point. First, that it's just a very competitive environment, and that it's challenging to really stick out at that level that you describe, and it's also important to try to stand out at the level at which you described. So I agree with the premise of your question. I do think that the biggest thing that the postdoc can influence at this point in their career is that set of papers, a couple of first authored works in high impact interdisciplinary journals that really have this sort of consistency of theme, like a real flavor, a real thesis that kind of cuts across the multiple papers. And then that's kind of grounded or built upon the foundation of multiple excellent papers in other excellent disciplinary journals. So I do think that's the biggest thing. And it's also the thing that a postdoc who's already started their postdoc can impact. The other thing that I think committees do look at, and they kind of filter by, is they do look at the university and the research group of the PhD and of the postdoc. And so they'll be looking for universities and departments that are in the top 10 or 20 globally, and research groups who are leading even within the very prestigious and elite context of those institutions. They'll be looking for research groups that are also really producing a lot of impactful work and a lot of great faculty candidates. I think there is a sense in hiring committees of training environments that are really good for future faculty. And I mean, the reason I just put that a second is I do think the most important thing is the publication record. But I also think the publication record is something you can do something about when you're already in your postdoc. Whereas if you're in your postdoc, you've kind of made your choices about both the PhD and the postdoc institution and group.
I heard once that a postdoc is like a second PhD. So you put so much effort into that, but it's just much shorter amount of time that you have to produce about the same impact as a result. So then you will be considered as a sort of legit researcher who can really take on a difficult faculty position. So is that the case, or should people, because there's a problem with the timeline often. So if you wait longer for more years until you accumulate that impact, that would be similar to your PhD, then you will probably skip so many opportunities. Many people are hired early on. So many universities prefer younger, so meaning that in the early postdoc years, younger researchers rather than those who are in the 4th year, 5th year of their postdoc. Is that something that you notice too, or is it very heterogeneous? So it's not really set in stone.
Yeah, it's a great question. And first, I'll acknowledge, I think, the premise of your question, which is it's sort of like a second PhD, but it's got to be somehow executed a little bit faster. But I think that's realistic because the first couple of years of a PhD, people are really learning to do research. And by the time they got their PhD and they're in a postdoc, they know how to do research. And so I think it's plausible to kind of come up with a 2 to 3 year plan to join a lab, really absorb the environment of the new lab. Like it's definitely not about sort of on day one going after your first big postdoc paper, because you're actually trying to take advantage of the new perspective, the new research questions, and the new research capabilities of your new group as a postdoc. So I think often it will take 1 to 2 quarters for the postdoc to kind of define a research agenda that truly levers the new environment that they joined. But then one does need to move fairly promptly to go advance that project and move in the direction of the big first authored publications. And in terms of the duration, I think a lot of us sort of talk of a postdoctoral appointment as being kind of the expectation of 2 years if things are going well, which entails you'll be applying for faculty positions even just about 1 year in to the 2-year postdoc. But I also feel that in real life, a lot of the most successful postdoctoral fellows who go after faculty positions, it actually can take them 3 or 3.5 years, and that's totally fine. And that, if that's the timescale we're talking about, it doesn't raise any concern with hiring committees that it will have been a 3 or 3.5 year postdoc by the time it's complete. Of course, maybe the faculty position will have been secured 3 years in, and maybe they'll start the faculty position 3.5 years in or something like that. I think that's very normal, and it certainly doesn't look too long. Of course, it has to be undergirded by this great record of productivity and impact and excellent publications during the postdoc. That's really the key. And I think that the timelines are a little more flexible.
Do you think that practicing applying for faculty position, because it takes sometimes some practice, so it's not really you just go and get it, that starting that practice early on the first year of a postdoc, not assuming that you're truly leaving your postdoc after this, but just trying to secure the position, trying to see how the committees may perceive you and your research direction, getting that experience is a very good approach to finding a position eventually.
I think that's right. And so I'll just add one more layer up, right, which is we run a sort of internal simulated competing for faculty positions process where we kind of gather together. We don't sort of bring the whole group in because some people are thinking about this and they're at that stage, and others are not really. They're just so focused on doing the research that they're not thinking about a plan to compete for faculty positions. But so we bring together kind of a smaller group that they're at the stage of trying to get ready to compete for faculty positions. We meet periodically. We talk about the strategy, the dossier, the cover letter, the CV, the presentation, the research presentation, the teaching presentation, et cetera. So we talk about all those things. And then we sometimes do some practice rounds. So people will get up and give a talk that's maybe simulating one of those, or we simulate the Zoom interview. And then we do a little roundtable and give each other feedback. And then, now I'm actually getting to your question, then people will often apply. Often it feels like the two chances to apply, one is like a little earlier than it should be, and the other is a little later than it should be, like they're a year spaced apart given the cycle. So yeah, a lot of people apply when it feels just a little early. And often they'll get the Zoom interview, or maybe they don't get the in-person interview, or they get the Zoom and the in-person and they don't get the job. And so they get to compete again next year. And yeah, they've had the experience of going through it a couple of times, both in our internal prep sessions and coaching sessions, and in a kind of very real dry run with like a real institution, a real hiring committee. And it's a very good experience for when they then go out, when they're really, really ready and they get the job. And of course, every once in a while, they get to the job on the first round, which is great.
You have to present certain ideas, of course, research proposals for your faculty application. So, Ted, when you mentor students and postdocs, do you provide feedback on their own research ideas that they want to present somewhere, or should it be completely up to them what they present? So it's not something that they share with their advisor. I know that there are different approaches from different people, and this is why I'm asking what's yours.
Well, certainly the decision about what they want to propose is entirely up to them. And the decision about whether they'd like to consult with me is completely up to them. Like, they certainly have no obligation to tell me what they would like to do. And they have no obligation to sort of see whether I'm happy with they're doing it. I mean, it's their research agenda, and I just want them to be successful. Having said that, a lot of times postdoctoral fellows whom I do advise do ask me for my advice on their research proposal, both the written bit and then when it comes to the interviews, to the presentation of it. And I'm always available to give them my thoughts and my inputs. And my thoughts and inputs are often of a sort of a strategic nature, so it's not in the weeds of the details of what they plan to do, but how do they get ready for the question, the standard question? Okay, you've got this amazing research agenda. It kind of looks like it levers your experience from your doctoral work and your postdoctoral work. But why do you think you can be competitive and successful as a faculty member when your postdoctoral advisor is still active in a related field, and while your doctoral advisor is also still related in this other kind of adjacent field? So being ready for that question with a really good answer is important. And the strategy around building the proposed program and kind of defending the proposed program needs to address that head on.
Speaking about the topic, so there are two general ways on the big spectrum that you can go. One way is that you pick a hot topic for a postdoc and do great work there, and compete for faculty. The other way is you take something that is not been developed yet. You're just trying to develop something completely new. You know that it's very risky, but it may pay off eventually. So in your experience, which way is more sort of beneficial if you want to compete for faculty eventually? Of course, there's a risk factor that you have to take into account, but often I see that. So I see it basically 50-50 myself. So some faculty do things that they did in the past, pretty much very, very similar at least. And some are trying to push in a completely different direction because, say, during the postdoc, they developed some kind of special tool that no one has, and they're pushing that direction. But the development took a lot longer. So what's the approach to sort of project, so ideation and the generation of projects when you really mentor your team?
Yeah, well, again, I think you've articulated the options quite well, and maybe there's sort of a spectrum in between those two options. But as you say, one, to sort of identify something that's just going really, really well, and it feels like you can just sort of clearly continue along that path. Maybe it's really building on your doctoral work and then extrapolating that into some additional impactful research in the postdoc. And yeah, maybe it's a bit of a lower risk strategy, especially when you think of getting the publications deterministic timescale. And then the other one is to be like deeply thoughtful and introspective about kind of trying to found a new field, but you can't quite found a new field in 2 or 2.5 years. And so you'll end up putting a few milestones down in this really new and ambitious thrust that you're developing. And yeah, I'm sure there's got to be a spectrum in between those two bookends as well. But I guess I think I'm like you. I've seen those two bookends be very successful. I've seen people land faculty positions in each of them, and I feel like there may be a rough 50-50 division amongst people who you might class into those two. So I feel like I can't really prescribe one is better than the other. I think it's a bit about one's personality and what one values, and I think postdocs should kind of make their own decision about their philosophy.
So one way that I noticed that it can work out with a risky topic where you have not ended up with a good paper, but you develop something unique, is that your advisor, who might be very well known, or I would probably say should be very well known, writes an excellent recommendation letter. So instead of having a paper that is very strong and ready for the committee to read, they read the recommendation letter of the advisor that can work in certain cases, and perhaps in many cases, again, depends on the advisor, of course. And that sort of moves us to the topic of recommendation letters. When I was a PhD student, I didn't quite know about it, but eventually I ended up, I realized that recommendation letters matter sometimes even more than your publication record, especially at top schools where people are hired based on how their advisor perceived them during their PhD and postdoc. So both PhD and postdoc are important. So what's your advice to the faculty candidates, or the people who maybe faculty candidates a bit too late, but for those who want to become faculties, they're about to graduate from a PhD, they want to look for a postdoc position. How should they strategize their recommendation letter agenda for faculty positions? Because if they join a group where faculties don't know how to write good recommendation letters, it may end up with, so they can get a lot of good papers, but no faculty position, because they have to get to the top 1% where fine things start to matter so much.
Yeah. So first, I'll agree that the recommendation letter is very important, but I will say that the most important thing is the published record of first author dissemination by the candidate. And then what I feel the recommendation letter does is it provides additional color, basically, around that. And so the writer of the letter, the advisor, gets to, of course, explain how the published record fits into literature and explains the role of the faculty candidate in developing the topics, developing the field. And so the advisor is able to communicate the degree of intellectual independence and originality that led to this publication record on the part of the postdoc. And then I feel like the rest of the letter kind of gets to go and talk about things that really don't make it into the CV, or you want them backed up by the letter. So an example would be contributions to grant writing, the development of the culture of the research group, collegiality, maybe the mentoring of emerging scientists, like some new doctoral students in the group. And yeah, just generally whether there's evidence from this ability to contribute to the collective success of the research group that the candidate has this kind of broad understanding of how to be part of the team. Of course, eventually they're going to be leading a team, but I think a great indicator on the way to being an effective leader is to show while they're a colleague within the team that they can really function very effectively and in a collegial way.
So in your opinion, what makes then a top one recommendation letter? So let's say there is a round of faculty, there's a call for faculty applicants, 500 people apply, they all have their own recommendation letters. What would the perfect recommendation look like in that case? If we look at the first top 1% of applicants, what does it really say? Because many recommendation letters, they look more or less similar. What really makes them stand out to a committee?
Yeah, I think the first thing at the start of the letter will be the advisor's perspective on the field of contributions, and then the very specific original contributions of the faculty candidate. And so it will really detail that. There's an element of a literature review here, and like, how does this work fit into the broader context? And then there will be a discussion of like this illustrated with very specific examples of evidence that this postdoctoral fellow was really original, dedicated, hardworking, and creative, and that the fact that this record of dissemination is so compelling is like directly a consequence of this postdoc's own hard work, commitment to true curiosity, true commitment to the scientific process and to really interesting scientific questions, as opposed to sort of somebody who's in a bit of a hurry to get stuff done and to get on the market. Somebody who's like underlying genuine interest in science is very sincere. And then I think it will finish with this sort of added color about contributions to mentorship, contributions to grant writing, and contributions to the success of the group. And then you kind of close with a conclusion about how, all this, it provides like a nice body of evidence in support of this being an extremely effective faculty candidate and future PI.
But it also means that the name of the person who recommends you is also important.
I think
not
that's
just
true.
the letter.
I mean, I think that's always true. I think the institution, the name, the department, I think it's all important. I guess I just think that if we're talking about somebody who's on the job market, they've placed that bet already. So,
okay. So the faculty positions often can attract up to 500 applicants, and yet there are many instances that I know where students receive faculty offers even before they finish their PhD. So they secure the position, and then they continue into postdoc, and then they become faculty eventually. So it suggests that they are very exceptional in certain ways. To stand out among 500 applicants, many of whom are postdocs, as a PhD student, it's really, really tough. In your observation, sort of from what you see, what are the key characteristics that such PhD students have that really make them so competitive?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll somewhat question the premise of your question, and you'll note that I think every other question I basically agree with your premise. I think what you describe is very rare, and maybe shouldn't be viewed as like the goal of the exercise. I think the goal of academic training through the PhD and the postdoc is to deepen one's scientific understanding, understand the research process in all its dimensions, from interdisciplinary impactful research to project selection to research integrity, the full spectrum of the research enterprise, research funding. And that does take a bit of time. It takes length of a PhD, 4.5 to 5.5 years, and it takes the length of an additional, of a postdoc, and in some kinds a second postdoc, which I think is fine. So Yeah, I don't see the rush, and maybe I can illustrate this with a personal example, which is I didn't do a postdoc. Even when I competed for faculty positions, it was quite unusual not to have a postdoc, and I didn't have
Mm.
one. And I think I missed an opportunity. Like I missed the chance to learn a new group, to learn another advisor, to learn another field, and to build my own independent program that harvests some of the best things from each of those groups, and then builds a truly distinct program. And so, at some level, I don't really have any regrets. I'm very happy with my group and the work that we've done. But I still think that doing a postdoc is a great opportunity for learning and professional development.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Even if you get a faculty position as a student, I think you should still use part of your startup, if possible, to do a postdoc at a good group where you can focus on your postdoc endeavors. Sort of, what would you recommend postdocs who want to become faculty but could not be this top 3%? They have to leave. What should they do? What do you usually tell them? Just leave academia or do a second postdoc? Try again. What is the best approach then to a career in such cases? Because it's basically 97% of the postdocs.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll actually say that in my view, the goal of doing doctoral work and doing research is not necessarily just to get a faculty position. I mean, I hope one does it for curiosity and love of learning and love of contribution. That's what's so exciting about doing research is you're not just learning, you are learning, but you're contributing to the future, contributing to knowledge that hasn't been acquired yet. So I think that's the reason to do a PhD, and that's the reason to do a postdoc. My research group, our alumni are broadly distributed amongst people who hold faculty positions, people who work at government labs, and many they're like really driving their own research agenda and really built names for themselves. People who work in industry, people who have founded companies, people who work in government and who work in policy, people who work at McKinsey and BCG and are advising corporations and governments. So it's just incredible, the diversity of things that you can do with a PhD and a postdoc, and the diversity of things that you are set up for uniquely by having done a PhD and a postdoc. So I think that is my answer to your question. Is I think that I'm very happy to talk with you about getting faculty positions, which is what we've done for the last half hour. But I think one should broaden the aperture and look at why we really do these things and why we engage with the research and the translational enterprise.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you so much.
All right. Nice to talk with you, Andrew. Thanks for thinking of me. Take care.
After recording this podcast, I decided to add some of my experience that is based on the hard lessons that I learned during faculty applications when I was back at Stanford. I mostly applied in the United States, but also partly in Europe. Also from the numerous discussions that I had with other faculty, especially younger faculties who worked at Stanford or who visited us. So I try to schedule maybe half an hour, with those people who are visiting Stanford to discuss how exactly they hire at their universities, any tips, any useful information that I could get about it, because I knew basically nothing about faculty applications. I didn't understand how people get faculty positions, how they become professors. And then, of course, I talked to many other candidates. One of the great things about Stanford is that there are a lot of people who come there specifically because they want to become professors in the future. So they come from great schools with very strong CVs, and so the likelihood of them becoming professors is relatively high. As a result, we could share our experience. We could see that there are candidates who can get thousands of interviews, and there are candidates who have maybe one or two interviews at best. And then in principle, you could try to correlate their success or the number of interviews they get or the offers they land with the CV, the advisor, where they get a PhD from, etc., etc. So in general, that information was very helpful to sort of create a general map of what those faculty applications really look like, and how to know in advance where you may have better chances, and most importantly, how not to make mistakes. One of the greatest problems with faculty applications is that they're exceptionally competitive. They're so competitive that even a little thing, a little mistake during interview can cost you basically a position. So that's something that I learned the hard way myself. And of course, I heard many other stories where people failed for not really big reasons. Each department has their own ways of assessing candidates. They have their own criteria. So that's not where I'm going to go into. What I want to do now is to discuss a number of points that I think that we did not cover during the podcast, and that I personally find to be extremely important to convey to you so you can get better prepared. The first point I want to mention is that the competition for faculties is enormous, especially in the United States. So in Europe, from what I can see, this competition is also rising, but it's not as big as in the United States. And probably the reason is that in Europe in general, we have different countries and different research styles, different expectations. So the competition is incredible, which means that the number of applicants who are relatively okay, who fit the position, can be up to 500. Again, 500 people, can be even higher. So then that number depends on many circumstances. For example, if the position is announced in a very specific niche field, for example, organic chemistries, and of course, somebody who does physics would unlikely apply for that position. But on the other hand, there are positions which are very broadly defined, and there are departments that hire broadly too. One example can be mechanical engineering departments. They're fairly diverse, and they're very, very versatile as to which topic they wanna have. So we often see a very broad spectrum of topics represented inside each mechanical engineering department. And there, the number of applicants can be enormous. So getting back to that competition, so there are candidates applying from all kinds of schools. And from my observations, for what I can see, the top US schools, which are Caltech, Stanford, MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, and some people also add their University of Chicago, Northwestern, Cornell, and some other schools, they have a lot of postdocs and PhDs who want to go to academia because they have very strong advisors. So those schools kind of statistically feed the market with very strong candidates. Like it or not, but that's how it works. And so that's something I discovered when I moved to Stanford. Before that, I was at Drexel, which was a relatively strong school, but it's definitely not Stanford. And so at Stanford, what I saw is that there are many labs that are filled with postdocs. There are tens of postdocs in the lab who want to go for a faculty position, and they may work on very related topics. And the thing is, if from every lab, every postdoc applies for a specific position, you can imagine how many people will be really in that list of candidates. Now, that's just Stanford. No, we should not forget that there's MIT, there's Caltech, which Caltech produces a lot of really strong faculties. Many people I know who got faculty positions in the last, say, 10, 15 years, they came from Caltech. There's UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, that produces a lot of faculties too. There are, of course, Harvard and Berkeley, where there are lots of candidates too that come from there. So one position can have hundreds of applicants from just the top schools. And then imagine that you're trying to compete there. Imagine that you need to stand out to the level when you will be interviewed. What do you need to have then to stand out? This is pretty tricky because if you use just metrics, it gets really tough to select people. You can't select people based on the number of papers because some people have fewer papers but much stronger work. You cannot select people based on their GPA, of course, because it's not really relevant. But there are certain things that you can use in your selection process that would be more or less used in more or less every department. And these trends, I think I observed to a certain degree. I'm not saying that this is, the truth that is set in stone, but I want to say that this is something that you probably want to keep in mind, or you want to discuss with your professor, with your advisor, if you want to go for faculty positions later. Now, because of such a high competition, there is a certain perfectionism that the departments have when they select candidates. So it's not uncommon to see that the department decides to interview, say, 5 people, and then none of them would fit their vision for the position. And they would just close the position, reopen it next year. And that's where you can argue, well, out of 500 applicants, perhaps there was someone who would be a perfect fit. Moreover, that person can reapply next year and get invited to an interview. It just makes no sense then, right? But that's the reality. The reality is that you may get buried in that pile of applicants. And even if you stand out, in general, you may be missed by the committee. And the second thing is that the committee looks for a perfect candidate. And there could be little things that don't work out during the interview, or just maybe you're just too tired. Maybe your people skills are not very perfect. Maybe you're a bit of an introvert. Maybe you didn't quite explore the funding opportunities that you would have when you become a faculty. So at the interview, something went not so perfectly, and then the committee decides that you're just not a good fit. Just for a little thing. And that's something we hear from candidates from time to time. And I think that's something that you keep in mind, that this extreme competition leads to perfectionism inside the departments. And that also leads to the selection criteria that one may question, but they're not very logical if you're not a faculty yet. Like, you're not sitting in that committee, you're not part of the department. So you're just a postdoc, or you're just a PhD student. So those criteria might not look so straightforward to you. Moving on. So the recommendation letter is extremely, extremely important. That's something I learned the hard way, because I never really thought that somebody would be reading a recommendation letter. In Europe, that's not quite the case. Some departments do require recommendation letters, but it's not very common. Now, in the United States, recommendation letter is everything. So you can have very few papers. You can have a lot of unpublished data, and your recommendation letter would be the most valuable asset you have that can land you a position. Of course, you have to go through the interviews and everything, but again, like winning that very first step where you have to stand out among hundreds of very strong candidates, this is where your recommendation letter can be helpful. That's something I didn't realize when I was a candidate back then, when I was a postdoc or a PhD student. It didn't make quite sense, because when you're a student, you often think in terms of meritocracy. You often think that the grades you receive, the accomplishments that you have, should matter a lot more than the personal opinions. But then later it turns out that when people hire, and they hire their closest colleagues, meaning the professors that will be sitting next door and with whom they would have to interact for the next 10, 20, 30 years, they actually look at a lot of those personal traits much more closely than you would expect. And so this is where a strong recommendation letter can be a real deal breaker. But I also cannot tell you what a great recommendation letter looks like, because you have to read it. You have to see that specific letter that landed a position at the top university. I also learned that the recommendation letters matter more at the top universities. So the higher the ranking of the university, the more likely they will look at your recommendation letter very carefully. If you go to a lower ranked university, now their recommendation letter, of course, can still matter and people would still read it.
But they would still be looking at other things, such as the metrics. How many papers do you have? Are you able to produce a lot of papers? Are you able to write grants? And how many grants can you write per year? What are your ambitions? Are your ambitions in line with what the university can offer you in terms of resources? Some universities, of course, will ask whether you're a great teacher, so they will check it during the interview. So there could be a lot of things that can go on top of recommendation letters, but from my observation, recommendation letters really matter more when you go to the top universities. It doesn't mean that you can get a position with crappy science. That's impossible. But it means that you may stand out despite having lower metrics. And that's where my big advice would be to look for a person who can write those recommendation letters, and for someone who knows the value of recommendation letters in faculty hiring. So when I talk to other faculty about what a great recommendation letter looks like, they would often say that, well, the advisor should say something like, this postdoc or that PhD student is or was one of the best people in my lab that I've ever had. And of course, not every advisor would write like this for a PhD student. And this is where younger professors are less likely to graduate faculties, especially during assistant professorship, because they don't have enough experience. So their recommendation letter is not as, it doesn't have the same weight. But of course, there are other advantages of joining a lab with an assistant professor there, which we can cover later. Of course, there are a lot of interesting points to mention. Another problem with the recommendation letter is that it doesn't always have to say something. It should also have the name of the professor who's well known. So if the committee doesn't know the name, doesn't recognize the name on that recommendation letter, so they don't know your advisor, it's not very likely they will take it seriously. They may even call that advisor, but it's not likely that they will see it as a great asset in the first place. So as a result, like it or not, but that's something, again, I learned. Like, if you want to stay in academia, you want to go to professors who are relatively well known, because your chances increase substantially. It does not mean that you cannot land a faculty position from a lab that is not well known. Of course, there are many people who get faculty positions, but again, the probability drops. We see young faculties getting hired in the last 10 years in many universities, and now I talk about top 20, top 30 universities in the United States. Many young faculties, they come from famous labs. So that's the reality. And I don't know if it's good or not. It's hard to say, because I'm pretty sure those candidates are very strong. But personally, I don't really like the system where the candidates are selected based on the name of their advisors, but it's not uncommon. So just keep it in mind. Now, the next thing that I want to mention is about being from the top group. So I didn't quite understand how important it is, but then my experience, my interaction with others, and my observations of who's getting the most invitations to interviews says that, well, it matters hugely, especially for, say, top 20, top 30 schools. And by being from the top group, I mean basically who your advisor is. What is his or her name, and how well they're recognized in their field. If you don't know if the group is very well respected, very well known, you can talk to your advisor. But often, I mean, I don't like it personally, because it's the way, even though it's the way the system works, it's not the way I wish it could work. But the top groups are often distinguished by the top publications so it means heavily cited papers in the top journals. Second is they often reside at top universities. And third, they often have plenty of faculties who graduated from that group. Often you would be surprised at how many things you can learn in such groups, but not every group is created equal. So in some way, joining a top group can be a big turning point in your career, but it can also damage your chances in other aspects. For example, there are groups where professors intentionally encourage students and postdocs to compete with each other. And that's not creating a healthy lab environment where people can help each other, where people can amplify each other. That's not happening there. So as a result, yeah, you can get that name in your CV and perhaps you will land a few interviews, but you also probably won't learn how to create a great work culture in your group, how to find the best talents, how to ensure that your science is the most rigorous science possible. So there are a lot of things that you can miss by going to the groups that don't have the right working environment, but yet they may have very good name that your CV will get. So there are certain things you can miss by going to a wrong group, and those wrong groups can be everywhere. It doesn't have to be a top group, it can be less well-known groups. There are also groups that you don't want to join at all. But I wanted to say just that the top groups seem to be one of those things that correlate with your chances of landing an interview, landing a faculty position. So in some cases, you may have relatively weak work in that top group, and yet you will become a faculty. That's also something that is possible. It's also very important to keep in mind that time is absolutely critical. When exactly you apply for a faculty position matters hugely. And that's something that I learned myself the hard way. My mistake was that I started applying for faculty positions in my second year of a postdoc. Why was that a mistake? Because I didn't use the opportunity of the first year. It's not very obvious, so let me try to explain the logic. Younger candidates are more preferred, especially at top universities. And by young candidates, I mean those who have just finished their PhDs. It's not like I agree with that logic, and it's not like a lot of people share that logic, but it's something that I observed many times and something that I was told by other faculty who serve in committees also quite a number of times. So why is the first year of your postdoc is so important? It's because the faculty hiring committees, they often don't care about your postdoc results if you've just started your postdoc. They will just look at what you have achieved in your PhD. And it's the first year of a postdoc is probably the time when you finish all your PhD papers and maybe some other duties, some other stuff. You got some awards from your PhD. So it's the time when your PhD shines the most, but your postdoc has not ramped up to the level at which it should be evaluated logically. You see? So in some way, you can say, okay, I'm working as a postdoc on this and this and this in your cover letter, but you don't have to really back it up with papers that you've published or the awards that you received. And your recommendation letter from your postdoc advisor, of course, also matters less so. But if you're in a lab of a well-known professor as a postdoc in your first year, that name can also help. Now, starting from the second postdoc year, you probably have to show your results. So if your postdoc project takes 2-3 years to finish and somehow another year to publish, then you're in a situation when you have nothing to show, and you've spent a number of years in your postdoc. That's not good. That's where most candidates are not invited to interviews. Again, there are so many candidates from the top schools. There are always those who have finished their projects in their second or third postdoc year, and we have excellent recommendation letters too. So just something to keep in mind. Okay. Now, going into your fourth year and fifth year of a postdoc, I spent about 4 years as a postdoc, and later years, they didn't quite add to my chances of being invited to an interview. So I was told by a number of people that I was just basically getting academically too old to be considered as a strong candidate for faculty positions. I mean, I was young, I was ambitious, I had very interesting, I still think that I had excellent research ideas that I proposed, and yet it clicked only in a couple of places. It did not lead to a wide number of invitations. And finally, if you are on a postdoc fellowship, it's better to apply early on too, because the fact that you've got that fellowship, it means that you was already pre-selected in some other competition before, and then faculty committees, they really like it. So try to use it to your advantage. Now, I want to discuss the quantity versus quality. And that's where there's a lot of misconceptions and there's a lot of variations. So some departments tend to pick candidates who publish more. Some departments tend to pick candidates who publish mostly in Nature, and others pick candidates who just have some reasonable number of papers, regardless of how many. And this is where you never know in advance. So I always advise just apply and you will see if you're invited. Now, whether you should be pursuing quantity over quality, it's a difficult question when it comes to faculty interviews, because in some cases you can get more interviews by publishing few more papers. And by few papers, I mean ideally first authorship, because you want to show that you've done that. But of course, if you publish 2-3 papers in your, say, in 1 or 2 years of your postdoc, it likely means that those papers are relatively shallow. That's the reality. If you're the first author on those papers, most likely these are relatively simple studies, because if you could spend those 2-3 years or 1 to 2 years on a single study, that study would be perhaps much deeper. And so then you start to compete with the people who publish only one study, but perhaps in a high impact factor journal, maybe in Nature, the most likely in Nature, because many candidates do have Nature papers. And then you have to compete with people who publish high quality work, but only, say, one paper, but in some of the top journals. And often my observation again is that the candidates who published one paper in, say, Nature, they outcompete those who publish 3 papers in low-rank journals. Is that the way that hiring should be done? I'm not really the person to judge it. So I don't really know, to be honest. I think it really depends on the circumstances, and it really depends on the work. There are some absolutely amazing studies in Nature. So ideally, you want to have a paper from your postdoc that would surprise an entire department, where people will be like, yeah, that's a big study. It doesn't matter then if the study is just one paper or 2-3 papers, as long as you can present it in a way that makes it very impactful and surprising for the people sitting in the room, they would give you a lot of credits for this, because it's not something that is happening very often. It depends on where you work. So at your university, perhaps there are faculty candidates invited to campuses. Just go there. Look at their talks. Most of the departmental seminars are open door, so you can come and look at what they present. Check it out. You will see that not every talk is amazing. Not every science is great. Much of it can be pretty trivial. And yet the candidate is invited. Try to understand why. Maybe you can talk to your advisor. Maybe you can talk privately to the department head. I strongly suggest exploring it, so you will see that variation between different candidates, and then you will see where you may fit with your research, your results, your accomplishments. The next thing that I was very surprised to learn is that the PhD is more important than my postdoc. Even when your PhD was years ago, the committees will still look at what you did during your PhD, what your PhD advisor thinks about you, about your work, about your contribution, etc. And they can give it more weight than to your postdoc experience, even though your postdoc is much more recent than your PhD. Something that I was very surprised to realize at some point, but I was clearly told that a number of times, and I could see the correlation in sort of who your PhD advisor was and where you did your PhD and what was the topic of your PhD with where the candidates often land. And that's why, again, I have to highlight that you want to apply for faculties early on, as early as possible. There's also another reason for this, which is that there could be positions open in some departments where you probably want to land eventually. There are some dream schools you may have, and those positions may get closed next year. So try to apply today. Who knows? There's always a chance you may get invited. Interestingly, where you got your bachelor doesn't really matter from what I understand. However, if you apply to a department that requires teaching in specific disciplines where you don't look like you're trained based on your CV, for example, you're applying to a chemical engineering department with a PhD in physics, you will likely be dismissed. But if you apply to mechanical engineering, most likely they will still look at you more carefully. Now, speaking about the topics, there is one important point that if the department says, okay, we're looking for somebody who does material science, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're looking for that specific person. They may hire somebody with a chemical engineering background or a chemist or even someone from a biochemical background. So it's not necessarily that niche topic that they're looking for. In the United States, it looks like they often have to put some sort of topic in the announcement, but they may still go for a broad search when they actually select candidates. You know, one of the pieces of advice that I got when I was a postdoc is to apply nevertheless, even if I don't see that the topic fits me. Unless, again, it's a very niche, very, very fine, like, okay, we're looking specifically for organic chemists, and that organic chemist must have this kind of qualifications and must teach these courses, then yeah, likely they're looking for that specific person. But in many instances, it can be relatively broadly defined or in some broad niches, and that means that you can apply anyway. Don't treat it as if you're not a good fit. There are many people who got accepted, who got offers for positions where they wouldn't fit the description. Now, because recommendation letters matter more at a top university than at a low-ranked university, I know cases where the candidate could land a faculty position at the top university like MIT, for example, and was not invited to any other university at all, even for an interview. It's interesting the way it works because I think there is a certain different, like the selection criteria are on the spectrum between the top universities and low-ranked universities. So depending on where you go, depending on your profile, you can land in kind of on different sides of the spectrum. So you may have few publications, but an excellent recommendation letter, and you can get an offer from the top place, while other places will see it as a weakness. So they won't care so much about your recommendation letter. They will look at your publication record. And if your publication record is not so strong as they expect you to have, they will not hire you. And of course, there are reasons for this. Again, some departments look more at the metric side because they know that that's what brings the money. Maybe that's how they see the system works. And some departments look more at who you are and how capable you are of becoming a leader in your field. And that's how they think the system works. Again, of course, the same we can see partly in Europe, but I would say it's European landscape is very heterogeneous. It depends a lot on where you go. There are many different types of positions. There are some intermediate positions. There are some institutes. And there are different ways that your position can be funded. And so as a result, in Europe, there's more diversity. but also there's more complexity.